My wife and I had front row seats that night. 2 tickets to The Tonight Show. That is what we thought we were getting. I was 24 years old. Nobody in that studio had any idea what was about to happen 3 feet in front of us. Then Muhammad Ali said it. Live. To Sonny Liston's face. Bruce Lee would knock you out in 3 seconds. My wife grabbed my hand so hard she broke my watch. The studio went silent. You could hear the stage lights. Then Liston stood up. 3 words. The network switchboard crashed in 9 minutes. Security almost separated them on live air. I am 79 years old now. I was sitting in row 2. I never forgot what those 3 words did to that room.
NBC Studios, Burbank, California, November 1969, Friday night. The Tonight Show, starring Johnny Carson. Studio audience of 400 people settled into their seats, coffee cups in hand. Programs on laps. The specific relaxed anticipation of people who have come to be entertained and expect exactly that, and nothing more. The stage is familiar. The desk, the chairs, the painted Los Angeles skyline behind the set. The NBC orchestra warming up in the corner. Gerald Myers, a production assistant who has worked on the show for 18 months, is standing in the narrow corridor backstage holding a clipboard and sweating through his shirt, despite the studio air conditioning running at full capacity. He has handled difficult guests before. A comedian who arrived drunk. An actor who refused to sit next to another actor. A senator who demanded his chair face a specific direction for reasons nobody understood. None of that prepared him for tonight. Tonight, he is responsible for managing 3 men who should never have been put in the same building, let alone the same television segment. One of those men is Muhammad Ali. One is Bruce Lee. The third is Sonny Liston. And 12 minutes ago, something happened in the hallway between their dressing rooms that has changed the entire plan for tonight's show in ways that Gerald cannot yet calculate and is deeply afraid to report to his producer. It started 6 weeks earlier in Johnny Carson's private office on the 2nd floor of the NBC Burbank building. Carson was meeting with his producer, Fred de Cordova, a veteran Hollywood man who understood television the way surgeons understand the body, which is to say, completely and without sentiment. Ratings had been strong, but Carson wanted something that people would talk about on Monday morning. Something that the newspapers would cover. Something that could not be replicated or planned or produced by any competing network because it would emerge from the specific and unrepeatable chemistry of specific people placed in specific proximity under specific circumstances. "I want something real," Carson said. "Not scripted real, actually real." Fred, who had known Carson for 20 years and understood what that meant, leaned forward. "How real, Johnny?" "As real as television has ever been," Carson said. Fred spent a week making phone calls. What he assembled was not a guest list. It was a chemical formula. Muhammad Ali, 27 years old, stripped of the heavyweight title 2 years earlier for refusing Vietnam induction, in the middle of his exile from boxing, the most recognizable face on earth and the most dangerous conversationalist in any room he entered. Bruce Lee, 29 years old, teaching martial arts in Los Angeles, appearing in small film roles, known in certain circles as something extraordinary but not yet known to the world as what he actually was, which was the most complete expression of a human being operating at the absolute outer edge of physical possibility. And Sonny Liston, former heavyweight champion of the world, the man who had terrified an entire sport for a decade, the man whose hands were registered as lethal weapons in 3 states, the man who had walked into every room of his adult life as the most physically dangerous thing in it, until Ali took his title, until Ali made him a footnote. until Ali spent 4 years telling anyone who would listen that Sonny Liston was finished, was old, was afraid, was nothing. What Carson and de Cordova had assembled was not a television segment. It was a room full of combustible materials and one very expensive match. Bruce Lee arrived at NBC Studios at 5:15 in the afternoon, 3 hours before showtime. He came alone. No manager, no entourage, no publicist. Just Bruce carrying a small leather bag, wearing a dark mandarin collar jacket, and simple black trousers. The production assistant who met him at the entrance, a young woman named Carol, recognized him immediately and felt something she would spend years trying to describe accurately. She would eventually settle on this formulation. He moved through the corridor, and his footsteps made no sound. On a concrete floor, the man walked like he was floating. He was shown to dressing room 1. He set his bag down, removed his jacket, and began to stretch. Slowly, methodically, every joint, every muscle, a ritual performed not for show, but for readiness. Bruce Lee did not warm up for performances. He prepared for anything. Muhammad Ali arrived at 5:45 in a black car that drew a crowd of NBC staff into the parking lot the way a magnet draws iron filings. He was wearing a suit that cost more than most people in the building made in a month, and he wore it the way he wore everything, like he had been born specifically to wear it. And the suit understood this and was grateful. He moved through the backstage corridor with the rolling, unhurried confidence of a man who has been the most important person in every room he has entered for the past decade and has made peace with that fact. He stopped to shake hands with every person he passed: camera operators, set builders, the woman who ran the coffee cart. He remembered names from his previous appearances on the show. He asked about children, about health, about whether the coffee cart woman's daughter had gotten into that nursing program she mentioned last time. Ali forgot nothing about people. It was the most disarming thing about him. You expected a champion. You got someone who remembered your daughter's name. Sonny Liston arrived at 6:30, and nobody came to the parking lot. His car pulled up to the service entrance at the back of the building, the entrance used for equipment deliveries, and he came in through a door that opened onto the maintenance corridor. Not because he was ashamed, because Sonny Liston had learned over the course of his life that entrances through front doors produced reactions from people that he found exhausting. The stairs, the stepping back, the involuntary reassessment of personal safety that happened in people's eyes when they registered his dimensions and his face, which had absorbed enough punishment over the course of his career to look like a map of everywhere he had ever been. He was wearing a dark suit that fit him the way suits fit men who are shaped by violence rather than tailors. He walked the maintenance corridor alone, his footsteps heavy, deliberate, each one a small declaration of mass against the concrete floor. Gerald Myers met him at the junction between the maintenance corridor and the dressing room hallway, and walked him to dressing room 3 without speaking more than 6 words, because Sonny Liston did not invite conversation, and Gerald Myers had enough self-preservation instinct to recognize when silence was the correct choice. At 7:15, Fred de Cordova came to Bruce's dressing room for the pre-show briefing. He knocked twice. "Come in," said a calm voice. Fred entered to find Bruce standing in the center of the room, perfectly still, eyes closed. Fred waited. He knew enough about Bruce Lee not to interrupt whatever this was. Bruce opened his eyes. His expression did not change in the way expressions change when people are startled or embarrassed. It simply opened, like a door that had been closed and was now open, no transition visible. "Fred," Bruce said, "good to see you." Fred walked him through the format. 3 guests tonight. Allie comes out first, 10 minutes with Carson alone. Then Bruce joins them. Then Liston. All 3 together for the final segment. Light, conversational, nothing physical. Fred paused after the last 2 words, the same way he had paused the first time he said them to himself, aware that they were doing a great deal of work and might not be up to the task. Bruce caught the pause. "You have said nothing physical twice," Bruce observed, in the same tone a doctor uses to note a symptom that confirms a diagnosis. Fred shifted his weight. "Sonny Liston has been informed that Johnny Carson considers you the most impressive physical specimen ever to appear on this show." Bruce said nothing for a moment. Then, quietly, almost to himself, a former heavyweight champion who lost his title to the man sitting next to him, now told that a martial artist from Hong Kong is more impressive than he is on live television, in front of 50 million people. "Fred, that is not a television segment. That is a pressure cooker with the valve removed." Fred looked at him. "Are you uncomfortable, Bruce?" Bruce turned back to the mirror and straightened his collar. His hands were perfectly steady. "I am never uncomfortable, Fred. I am calculating." Fred left the dressing room feeling the specific unease of a man who has just realized that the situation he designed is no longer fully under his control and may never have been. At 8:50, 15 minutes before showtime, it happened. The incident in the hallway that would turn a planned television segment into something nobody in the building was prepared for. Allie had stepped out of his dressing room to walk, the way he always walked before a public appearance, slowly, loose, talking to himself in a low murmur that was not quite prayer and not quite strategy, but contained elements of both. He turned the corner of the backstage corridor and found himself facing the door of dressing room 3, which was open, and inside dressing room 3 was Sonny Liston, seated in the reinforced chair that the production team had brought in for him, looking at nothing, his massive hands resting on his knees, his face carrying the specific expression of a man sitting with thoughts he has been sitting with for a long time and has not resolved. Allie stopped. He looked at Liston. Liston looked at Allie. 4 years of history moved through the hallway between them without a word being spoken. Then Allie smiled, the smile that had driven Liston to distraction across 2 fights and a decade of press conferences, the smile that said, "I know something you do not know, and I am enjoying knowing it." He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, and said in a voice loud enough to carry down the corridor in both directions, casual, almost offhand, as if making conversation about the weather. "You know, Sonny, Bruce Lee would knock you out in 3 seconds." The corridor went absolutely silent. Gerald Myers, standing 20 feet away with his clipboard, felt the temperature change the way you feel a storm arriving before the rain starts. Liston's hands, resting on his knees, became fists. Slowly, without drama, the way water becomes ice. He raised his eyes to Allie. 3 seconds of silence that felt like 3 minutes. And then Sonny Liston said 3 words. 3 words that Gerald Myers heard clearly and would repeat to no one for 30 years. 3 words that contained everything Sonny Liston had ever felt about Muhammad Ali, about Bruce Lee, about the decade that had taken his title and his reputation and replaced them with this, a dressing room in a television studio waiting to be introduced to 50 million people as the 3rd most impressive man on a couch. The 3 words were not angry. That was the thing that made them unforgettable. They were not a threat, and they were not a dismissal, and they were not the kind of words that fight promoters print on posters. They were 3 words spoken at conversation volume by a man who had decided in that moment to say the most true thing he knew and let it land wherever it was going to land. Gerald Myers heard them. Ali heard them. And 11 minutes later, 50 million people heard them when Sonny Liston repeated them on live television, sitting 3 feet from Muhammad Ali and Bruce Lee, looking directly into camera one, his voice so level and so quiet that Carson leaned forward unconsciously, and the studio audience held its breath, and the network switchboard began receiving calls before the sentence was even finished. Carson introduced Ali first. The audience stood. They always stood for Ali. He walked through the curtain with that walk, the one that made every room he entered feel like it had been waiting for him, and settled into the guest chair with the ease of a man who has spent more hours in front of cameras than most people spend sleeping. Carson and Ali had a chemistry that television rarely produced. 2 men who were each the most complete version of something. One, the greatest entertainer in the medium. One, the greatest performer in sport, finding in each other an audience worthy of their best work. They talked for 8 minutes. Ali was brilliant, funny, philosophical, precise. He talked about his exile from boxing, about what 3 years away from the ring had taught him about patience, about what patience had taught him about power. Carson asked smart questions. The audience laughed and leaned forward some more. It was perfect television, effortless and alive. Then Carson's expression shifted. Subtle, almost imperceptible. But Ali caught it, and Bruce Lee, watching from the wings, caught it. Carson was about to change the composition of the room, and everyone who understood what was about to happen held something back. Some breath, some word, some forward lean, waiting. "Bruce," Carson said, "I'd like you to join us." And Bruce Lee walked through the curtain. The audience did not stand this time. They did something more interesting. They went quiet. The specific quiet of people registering something they cannot immediately name. Bruce walked to the desk, and the audience felt what Carol, the production assistant, had felt in the corridor. That floating walk, that coiled stillness, that quality of someone who is always entirely present and never performing presence. He shook Carson's hand. He nodded at Ali. Ali looked at him with the specific attention that Ali gave to things he found genuinely interesting, which was not many things. They sat. The 3 of them, Carson behind his desk, Ali and Bruce side by side in the guest chairs, and the audience settled back into itself, recalibrating, sensing that the show had changed, but not yet knowing into what. Carson asked Bruce about his philosophy. Bruce talked about water, about formlessness, about using the opponent's force against them. Ali listened with his chin in his hand, nodding slowly, the nod of a man who is hearing something he already knows from a direction he did not expect to hear it. "You and I are saying the same thing," Ali said, "just in different languages." Bruce looked at him. "Perhaps," Bruce said, "though I suspect your language is louder." The audience laughed. Ali laughed. Carson laughed. And in that moment of laughter, the curtain at the back of the stage opened and Sonny Liston walked out. The laughter stopped. Not because Liston did anything threatening, not because he moved aggressively or spoke or made any gesture that could be described as hostile. It stopped because of what he was. Because 400 people in a studio audience and 50 million people watching at home processed Sonny Liston's physical reality simultaneously, and the processing took all available attention. He was wearing a dark suit, and he walked to the desk, and he did not look at Carson, and he did not look at the audience. He looked at Ali. Then he looked at Bruce. Then he sat down in the chair that had been placed at the end of the desk for him, and the chair accepted his weight with a sound that made the three people nearest to him shift slightly in their own seats. Carson welcomed him. Liston nodded. The studio was quiet, in the way it had not been quiet all evening. A different quality of quiet, a quiet with weight in it. Carson, who had navigated more difficult moments in 30 years of live television than most people encounter in lifetimes, did what Carson always did. He found the door. "So," Carson said, leaning forward with the practiced ease of a man opening a conversation he has opened 1,000 times. "We have three extraordinary men at this desk tonight. Three men who have each, in their own way, redefined what the human body is capable of. I want to ask each of you something. When you look at the other two men sitting here, what do you see?" Ali went first. He looked at Liston. He looked at Bruce. He smiled the smile. "I see two men," Ali said, "who the world has underestimated." He paused. Then he looked directly at Liston. "Sonny," he said, his voice dropping slightly, losing the performance and finding something underneath it. "You know what I think about you? I think you were the most physically dominant heavyweight who ever lived. Not the best, but the most dominant. There is a difference. And I think Bruce Lee," he looked at Bruce now, "I think Bruce Lee is the most dangerous man in this room. And I think Sonny Liston knows it. And I think that is why we are all sitting here tonight, pretending this is a normal television show." The studio went completely silent. Carson did not move. Bruce did not move. And Sonny Liston, who had not moved since sitting down, turned his head very slowly toward Muhammad Ali. The turn took 2 full seconds, and then, at conversation volume, without anger, and without performance, and without any of the theatrical electricity that the moment seemed to demand, Sonny Liston said 3 words. 3 words that the studio audience heard in the silence as clearly as if they had been broadcast through the overhead speakers. 3 words that 50 million people in 50 million living rooms heard simultaneously, and that the NBC switchboard began receiving calls about before the segment ended. 3 words that Carson would say in interviews for the next 30 years were the single most powerful thing ever spoken on his stage. "Prove it then." 2 words directed at Ali. 1 word directed at everyone. Prove it. Then, not a challenge, not a threat. A door. A door that Sonny Liston had been standing in front of for 4 years since Ali took his title and replaced his name in the record books with a footnote. A door that said everything he had never been given the platform to say. You say I was the most dominant. You say he is the most dangerous. You sit here on television and you make your declarations and your assessments and your pretty philosophical statements about water and formlessness and the difference between dominance and greatness. Prove it then. Carson felt the moment the way you feel a wave before it reaches you, in the pressure of the air, in the change of the light. He looked into camera 1, and he did something that his producer, Fred de Cordova, would later describe as the single greatest instinct in 30 years of watching Carson work. He said nothing. He let the 3 words sit in the studio and in 50 million living rooms, and he did not fill the silence with a joke or a transition or a commercial. He let it breathe. He let it be exactly what it was. The most honest thing said on American television in 1969. Bruce Lee uncrossed his legs. He leaned forward slightly. He looked at Sonny Liston the way he had looked at everything that required his full attention, completely, without reservation, with the focused precision of a mind that never approached anything at less than its entire capacity. And he said something that nobody on that stage, or in that audience, or in those 50 million living rooms expected him to say. He said, "You are right, Sonny." Carson blinked. Allie turned. Liston did not move. "You are right," Bruce said again. "Words are easy. Declarations are easy. I have spent my life saying that the doing is the only thing that matters, and the talking is nothing. And yet, here I sit, talking." He paused. The studio was so silent you could hear the overhead ventilation system. "So let me stop talking." He stood up. Not dramatically, not performing the standing. Simply standing. The way he did everything. With the flat, certain economy of someone for whom every movement is exactly what it needs to be, and nothing more. He walked around the desk. He stood in the open space between the desk and the audience, and he looked at Sonny Liston. "You said, 'Prove it,'" Bruce said. His voice carried through the studio without a microphone. Every consonant precise, every syllable weighted. "I am not going to fight you, Sonny. That is not what you are asking, and we both know it. What you are asking is whether what I represent is real, whether the philosophy is real, whether a man my size, with my background, with my approach, belongs at this desk next to you." He paused. "So here is what I will prove." He looked at Carson. "Johnny, your hand, please." Carson, who had survived 30 years of live television through a combination of instinct and nerve, extended his hand without hesitation. Bruce took it, and then, in front of 400 studio audience members and 50 million people watching at home, Bruce Lee did something with Carson's hand that made Carson's eyes go wide, and made the audience produce a sound that was not quite a gasp and not quite a scream, but contained elements of both, and that the NBC switchboard would reference in over 40,000 calls in the next 90 minutes. Carson's knees buckled. Not completely, but visibly, unmistakably. The specific buckle of a man whose body has just been introduced to a force it did not know existed and does not have a category for. Bruce released his hand. Carson straightened. He looked at his own hand. Then he looked at Bruce. Then he looked at the audience. Then he looked into camera one. "In 30 years," Carson said, his voice slightly less steady than it had been, "nobody has ever done that to me. Nobody." He looked at Liston. "Sonny, your turn, if you want it." Liston looked at Bruce for a long moment. The moment lasted long enough that the studio audience began to shift in their seats. The specific restlessness of people watching something they cannot predict. Then Sonny Liston did something that Gerald Myers, watching from the wings, would say was the most surprising thing he witnessed in 2 years on the show. He extended his hand, not to fight, not to grab, open, waiting. Bruce took it, and whatever Bruce did, whatever precise and surgical thing Bruce Lee's fingers found in the architecture of Sonny Liston's hand, the former heavyweight champion of the world closed his eyes for 3 seconds. 3 seconds. When he opened them, something in his face had changed. Not softened, changed. The way a landscape changes after weather has moved through it. Still the same landscape, but different now, with new information written into it. "You feel that?" Bruce asked quietly. Liston nodded once. "That," Bruce said, "is what I have been trying to explain. Size is not the variable you think it is. Every nerve in your body is accessible. Every pressure point is reachable. The bigger the structure, the more precisely I can find what I am looking for." Liston looked at his own hand. Then he looked at Allie. Then he looked at Bruce. And he said something that the audience heard, and that the cameras caught, and that would be replayed for decades in documentaries and retrospectives and late-night conversations between people who could not stop thinking about what they had witnessed. He said, I have been the scariest man in every room since 1953. He paused. This is the first room where I was not. Carson looked into camera one. His eyes were wet. He would deny it in interviews for years. The tape does not lie. Ladies and gentlemen, Carson said, I have hosted this show for 7 years. I have sat at this desk with presidents and astronauts and legends. And I am telling you right now that what you just watched will never be matched. Not on this show. Not on any show. You just watched something real. And in this business, real is the rarest thing there is. The Tonight Show went to commercial. When it came back, the 3 men were still at the desk. Nobody had left. Nobody had moved. They were talking quietly. The 3 of them, Allie leaning forward, Liston turned sideways in his chair, Bruce with his hands folded in his lap. And the conversation they were having was not for the cameras, and not for the audience, and not for the 50 million people watching at home. It was for themselves. 3 men at opposite ends of every spectrum that the world uses to measure physical human beings, finding in a television studio in Burbank, California in 1969 that the spectrums they had spent their lives at opposite ends of were not as long as any of them had believed. The network switchboard logged 47,000 calls before midnight. The ratings were the highest in Tonight Show history. 3 newspapers ran front-page stories the following morning. One of them used the headline, "The Night Television Became Real." Gerald Myers kept his clipboard from that evening for the rest of his life. He never worked another show that came close to it. And my wife, who had worn her best dress for a Friday night out and broken my watch, grabbing my hand when Ali said those words, turned to me when it was over, when the credits were rolling and the studio lights came up, and 400 people sat in their seats not quite ready to stand and leave, as if leaving might break the spell of what they had witnessed. She turned to me and she said 4 words that I have thought about every day since 1969. She said, "Did that just happen?" And I said, "I think so." And she said, "Good, because I need someone to tell me it was real." It was real. I was there. And Sonny Liston's 3 words, "Prove it then," directed at Muhammad Ali, at Bruce Lee, at the world that had spent years making declarations about size and strength and dominance and greatness, without ever being asked to do the one thing that Sonny Liston, who had lost everything and sat at the end of a television desk with nothing left to protect, had the honesty and the courage to demand. Prove it. Then,